So this morning, as Hoshin mentioned, we are taking up Gate 98 of the 108 Gates of Dharma-Illumination. So Gate 98 says, the practice of the balanced state of dhyana is a gate of Dharma-Illumination, for it fulfills the 10 powers. So, golly, 10 powers, we have a lot of ground to cover today. I'll tell you now, we have a lot of ground to cover today. So the kanji translated here is practicing the balanced state of dhyana can also be read simply as practicing zazen. So this is not something exotic for us. This is our everyday moment-by-moment practice. So it might sound like this gate is about achieving some kind of particular mental state or physical state, but really it's about establishing our sitting practice and just going forward with that day by day, moment by moment. So we all know something about zazen. I don't need to go into too much about that, I think. We talk about that plenty here. As the first element of this gate statement. So as you know, I like to look at the first element, the second element, and then see like what's in that intersection. So not going to say a lot about zazen. We kind of know that territory, but we are going to intersect that with the 10 powers. So we need to know more about those. What are these 10 powers? So there are various versions of this list throughout the Buddhist tradition, depending on what you're looking at. In some cases, they are the powers of the awareness of a Buddha. In others, they're the 10 powers of a bodhisattva. It depends on the text and the time and the culture and what particular thing you're looking at. So today, I want to look at these as the 10 powers of a bodhisattva, right? Or bosatsu juriki, because we're all bodhisattvas here. We're all Buddhists here too, but it's a little easier to conceive of ourselves as a group of bodhisattvas. So it brings these powers, I think, a little bit closer to home. So the first one is devotion to the Buddha's teaching and no attachment to anything. So devotion to the Buddha's teaching and no attachment to anything. So this is described as jinshinriki, which is a deep mind power. So in other words, this isn't a sort of our everyday intention to practice. Oh, well, I'm going to make sure I sit zazen for a period a day or every day this week or something like that. This is not just a sort of general enjoyment of practice as something that there's an I that I like to do. Right? This is a profound understanding of the Dharma. This is a deep mind power. So I think there are two ways to look at this statement. If we add one word to the line. So devotion to the Buddha's teaching and therefore no attachment to anything, and devotion to the Buddha's teaching and also no attachment to anything. Because I think you could take this more than one way. So it's worth looking at both. So devotion to the Buddha's teaching and therefore no attachment to anything. Well, we know that the most basic things that Buddha taught were about non-attachment, right? Not clinging. So in the three poisonous mind, turning our greed into generosity, turning that clinging, right, into generosity. Understanding impermanence and seeing that there's really nothing we can cling to. There's nothing we can grasp, which persists through time. Seeing that all five aggregates are empty, as it says in the Heart Sutra. There is no self. There is no permanent fixed self. So committing to practice and doing regular zazen, where we drop off body and mind, lets us see these things for ourselves, or to see the way Buddha sees. So because we're doing Buddha's practice and studying his teachings and taking action in the world based on that, we have no attachment to anything. But what about devotion to the Buddha's teaching and also no attachment to anything? Well, even though we're devoted to the three treasures, ultimately, we don't even cling to those. So Buddha taught in various ways depending on who was in front of him and what karmic circumstances they were facing or they were coming out of. So sometimes it seems like he's saying contradictory things. In one place in the canon he says this, in another place in the canon he says that. The Dharma points us toward seeing and understanding the way the universe actually works, the three marks of existence. But just like once we've crossed a river, this very famous image about once you've crossed the river, you leave the raft behind. You don't keep carrying the raft on your back, right? So once we see for ourselves, we don't need to cling to teachings. Once we see the way Buddha sees, we don't need to cling to those teachings. So it would be easy to say devotion. We think devotion is a clinging, grasping thing, right? I'm really devoted to something. My goodness, I really want to hang on to that. So we have to be careful. We can be devoted to something and hold it lightly. So we take bodhisattva action based on our own prajna, and we kind of use the teachings to transcend the teachings. Right? So power number 2, increasing one's devotion. Or zojo jinshinriki. This is another deep mind power. So to increase your devotion is to hear everything as Buddha's teaching. It's not to work yourself into a frenzy, clinging to the Buddha, right? And trying to convince yourself that this is the one true way. This is about encountering everything as Buddha's teaching. This is seeing all sentient and insentient beings expounding the Dharma, is another way we put that, right? Everything completely manifesting Buddha nature. So to increase our devotion is not to increase our clinging and our worshipfulness. To increase our devotion is simply to see everything as Dharma, everything as Buddha nature. So there's a real feeling here in this power of something increasing, something growing, something becoming more powerful as we cultivate practice. So the first power is this sort of profound understanding of the Dharma, and the second one is continually deepening that understanding, right? So it's not enough to just say, I get it, and then to not do anything else. Yes, I get it, and also I'm continuing to cultivate, deepen my wisdom and compassion and understanding. So we know we'll never come to the end of Zazen work and study. We'll never come to the end of our bodhisattva vows. There's no end to that. We have myriad opportunities to understand every moment, everything we encounter, all activities, all forms, all beings as the Dharma. So even when we think we've got a pretty good handle on this practice and what Buddha said, things are becoming pretty familiar. We know what to do in the Zendo. Those same old quotes are same old quotes, right? There's always something even more subtle we can understand, even about the things with which we're very familiar. So we have to keep that spirit of inquiry. We have to be open to the next Dharma gate, the next opportunity, right? To open the hand, to see clearly, to see the way Buddha sees. Third Dharma gate, the expedient ability to instruct people and alter their conduct, or Hoben Riki. You might know Hoben. Sometimes this is translated as the power of employing expedient means to guide and embrace sentient beings. I kind of like that one better than changing somebody's conduct, right? So if we're embracing human beings, embracing beings, what are we doing there? Well, as bodhisattvas, we see clearly who's in front of us. We see what they need in order to be freed from their suffering. So each person needs something different, and the same person needs something different in a different place and time. So there's no one answer, right? There's no one size fits all when it comes to liberating beings. So we can't just have an answer and cling to the answer. We hear all the time about expedient means. Usually it's related to skillful action or beneficial action. But it's useful to consider why we use a word like expedient. I was wondering about this, like why expedient? Why not practical? Why not effective? Right? Like why expedient? Because expedient in this language usually means some action that gets the job done, but it might be improper or it might be immoral. Well, we did this, it was expedient, but maybe it wasn't completely wholesome or something, and you just think, what's going on there? We don't assume that all of our bodhisattva activity to liberate beings is problematic. We think, well, that's a pure activity, right? That's a completely wise, compassionate, skillful activity. So why expedient? Because, we're doing these things as bodhisattvas, we're behaving selflessly for the benefit of other beings. So what could be wrong with that? Well, in the Buddhist context, rather than proper or improper, the distinction is between relative and absolute, right? Between form and emptiness. So in the world of emptiness, there are no belongings that get lost or stolen, no human bodies that get sick or die, no delusion that's brought on by ignorance or intoxicants, no beings that are suffering, and yet, in this world on fire, we know there are suffering beings everywhere, and it's not helpful to tell them about emptiness in the midst of their acute suffering. Well, you're not really suffering because, you don't exist. That's not a teachable moment. That's not a skillful means. There are three poisonous minds. There are precepts being broken. There are toxic things happening, and there's suffering in the world. So we have to acknowledge this world of form and work within that context. This is the ground of practice. So just like Buddha taught different people differently, depending on their circumstances, we may have to put aside, if you will, the true nature of reality, the absolute point of view, long enough to help beings, suffering beings, in a concrete way. So it might be if somebody's hungry and can't afford food, that's not the time to say, well, in this world of emptiness, giver, receiver, and gift are all the same thing. And they're going, I don't care, I want a sandwich, We have to do something concrete in that moment. So sometimes we have to work with only part of the story in order to achieve our aspiration as bodhisattvas, right? And this is expedient means in a Buddhist context. So one of the ways we do that is with language. And hoben, or skillful means, always gets tied up in the duality of language. This has been going on for centuries. This is nothing new. In this world of social media, in this world of YouTube, this is nothing new. The duality of language goes back a long time. So the actual content, this is a problem because the actual content of Buddha's awakening cannot be expressed in language. So any attempt to, quote unquote, teach the Dharma using language will always be incomplete. And yet, right, we have to do it in order to liberate beings. We sit here every Sunday and we talk about the Dharma, and every Wednesday night we talk about the Dharma. We have to do it, and yet we know it cannot possibly be a complete expression of the Buddha's teaching. So we have to see reality from both sides and express both sides in one action, as we say around here, right? So, fourth, bodhisattva power, understanding what people think. Juriki. So traditionally, this is a supernatural kind of wisdom, to read the minds of beings. So today we may or may not believe in such things. If we sit long enough, or if we practice hard enough, right, we become Buddhists and read people's minds. But nonetheless, before we can really help somebody, we have to have some sense of what's going on in their heads. What are they thinking? What are they considering? How are they seeing the world? We have to watch. We have to listen. Before I say something, is it true? Is it helpful? Is it kind? Is this the right time to say that thing? Will this person be able to hear it and take it in and work with that, right? So we have to know what's on somebody's mind. So might there be some preconception at work here, or some prior experience that's influencing somebody's thinking? And maybe that's a hindrance, maybe that's a barrier to taking in this helpful thing I'm trying to do or say. Do I really understand what people are trying to achieve? Or do I just think I know what they're after and I'm going to help them do that? Well, what if I really don't know what their objective is? So when we cultivate wisdom and compassion in our practice, then naturally, of course, we're better attuned to other people, other beings, right? We're a little better able to put self over here and see who's actually in front of us and understand what they're actually thinking. Fifth power, satisfying people with what they want, or ganriki. This is actually, if you look at the kanji, the power of the bodhisattva vow in fulfilling the desires of sentient beings. So this is interesting. This isn't just, give people what they want. This is like, how do we really dig into the bodhisattva vow? What does that mean for us? Every time we chant those 4 vows, we're presented again with this huge challenge. We're about to do it again, right? We're presented with this huge challenge, freeing all beings from suffering, right? Eliminating all delusions, going through all the Dharma gates. In other words, seeing everything as the Dharma, every moment is an opportunity to practice. And completely manifesting Buddha's teaching, which has no boundary, no endpoint, in this limited human form. These are not things easily done, or perhaps ever finished, ever done, right? On the one hand, this seems kind of futile. We know we can't possibly carry out these bodhisattva vows all the way to the end. And on the other hand, that's a powerful thing. We're taking on something we can't possibly do in this limited human form. So we could feel weak and helpless about that, or we could say, actually, that's a pretty powerful thing to do. I know it's not possible to complete these vows, and yet I take them on anyway. So I'm putting my energy into selfless activity, even though by nature I'm caught up with the 3 poisons. So by nature I have hindrances. By nature I'm incomplete, and yet I'm taking on this huge challenge. So the fact of that contradiction, I think, makes this a powerful thing. This is not something we do casually. So sometimes we do this in front of a group of people and we get a Raksu and a Dharma name and a Kechimyaku, and that's fantastic. But we don't have to do that. We chant these vows all the time, and every time we do that, I hope we're not doing that casually. It's a reminder, right, of something really important in our practice. So we're not going to encounter that kind of aspiration very often in the world outside of here. So living a self-centered life, getting all the cherry pie I want, seems a lot more appealing, right? So when somebody stands up and says, I'm going to work for the liberation of all beings, that's not a small thing. That's a pretty powerful thing. Now, we can't get our ego attached to that. And yet, as a group of bodhisattvas, we've all decided we're going to stand up and do that to support each other in that. It's like really huge. So to go against our programming, if you will, is kind of a big deal. And yet, we can't cling to some idea about what great people we are for taking that on. Deciding to live as bodhisattvas, as soon as we do, we undercut that vow. As soon as we do, there's clinging to self, and there's all kind of stuff that makes that unravel. So there's a lot of work, there's a lot to work with this particular power. Number 6, no cessation of exertion, or juriki. So it's certainly important to apply ourselves to our practice and to make good effort. To be active in our practice and fully engage in zazen work and study, whether we're doing that here in the temple or we're doing it in our outside life activities. We need to practice with others regularly because it's just so easy to go off the rails when we do this on our own. No chance to sort of experience how our practice fits into the practice of the Sangha. What effect are we having? What effect is our practice having on other people, right? That's really important. It's an important aspect of our practice, element of our practice. So there's that kind of power of exertion. There's that kind of power of activity. Making the effort to come to sesshin or to book discussion or to participate in a work day, sitting zazen every day, having some direct experience of non-separation, of non-reliance. So that's one kind of exertion. But we also have to make sure that body, speech, and mind are all telling the same story, because sometimes they don't. So in other words, we have to make sure we're completely manifesting Buddha's teaching all the time, and there's no gap between what we think and what we say and what we do, because those are the 3 places we make karma, right? Body, speech, and mind. So we have to make sure those things are not telling different stories. If I think one thing, I say something else, are my actions matching, right? As soon as there's a gap, we've missed something. So it's not enough to go around saying, my teacher says, or I read this thing in a book, or something, right? What are we actually doing with this body and mind? Do we actually understand and experience the Dharma, or is it something that's still kind of out here somewhere that we read about, and we talk about, and we think about, but it hasn't made it here? So for the bodhisattva, there's no cessation of exertion, or no cessation of practice, because we're already completely not separate from the Dharma. The universe is practicing through us all the time. There's nothing outside of Buddha's way, so there's no disruption in practice, no hindrance to awakening, right? This is a fully functioning thing. And in this way, there's no cessation. So we're making effort, but there's no I making effort, right? 7th, bodhisattva power, including all vehicles without abandoning the Mahayana, juriki. So sometimes this is the power of the vehicle that transcends all vehicles. So in the Buddhist tradition, a vehicle is anything that can carry a being to the other shore of liberation. So depending on what you're looking at, there are anywhere from 1 to 5 vehicles, depending on the text, the tradition, the time, the place. So sometimes the vehicle is somebody's karmic situation. So, as a disciple who's working to liberate himself, but maybe not all beings, or as someone who liberates himself without help from anybody else, but is also not working to liberate others, or somebody who's a bodhisattva and working to liberate beings. So there's different kinds of dharma positions. There's different kinds of karmic circumstances. All of those things are vehicles. Sometimes the vehicle is the set of teachings or the tradition, like the Theravada and the Mahayana and the Vajrayana. In the development of the Buddhist tradition, by the time we get to the Mahayana, the Lotus Sutra is saying, well, there's really only one vehicle, which is the Buddha's actual ultimate teaching, and that all the other vehicles are expedient means to bring people into this one vehicle, to make this appealing and understandable and to bring people in, right? So all these circumstances and traditions and schools and sects aren't wrong, but supposedly they don't tell the whole story. So Soto Zen, of course, falls within the Mahayana school of Buddhism, hence this gate. So of course we privilege Mahayana to a certain degree as a vehicle, but we also recognize that that too is expedient means. It's a description of something which can't be described, right? So we practice within the Mahayana, and we don't abandon it simply because it's a skillful means. We don't say, well, okay, Mahayana falls short, so I'm going to not think about that, not work with that, right? So in the midst of the Mahayana, we recognize it's one part of maybe a larger vehicle, but that doesn't mean we abandon it, that we don't practice it. We remember that it's pointing us towards something beyond Mahayana forms and teachings, right? So including all the vehicles as Buddha's awakening that can't be expressed in words. So including all the vehicles without abandoning the Mahayana. So Mahayana might be our path towards something. Eighth power, the mysterious power of showing the appearance of every part of the body. Jinpenriki. Sometimes the power of the miraculous manifestations of the Tibetans in all the worlds in the space of a single hair follicle. Well, yikes. Again, we have a kind of a supernatural, miraculous power. This one points particularly to the powers used by a Buddha or a bodhisattva to teach and transform beings. So this is not a miraculous light show for the sake of entertainment. This is something miraculous which is done to teach and guide and transform beings. So Jinpenriki just means a divine power. But all the translations of this item, this part of this list I've seen, make reference to manifesting all the Buddhas of all the worlds in a single pore or hair follicle, right? So clearly this is an image of interconnectedness and all dharmas being reflected by all, right, in this tradition, all dharmas reflecting all other dharmas. So the Avatamsaka Sutra says, countless eons throughout the 3 periods of time, as well as the different features related to their formation and decay, are completely displayed in a single pore of the Buddha. The volume of space throughout the 10 directions can be known, but the scope of the Buddha's pores cannot be measured. Sentient beings with all their differences manifest completely on a single hair's tip. His spiritual transformations fill the world. The Buddha, with the unlimited strength of his spiritual powers, extensively proclaims his epithets equal to the number of sentient beings. All to hear according to their likes and pleasures. Multitudes in measureless, boundless lands, the Buddha encompasses in a single pore. The thus come one then sits serene amid the assemblies, the power of all sentient beings, blessing and virtue completely manifest. Now they return to the ocean of great blessings. So Buddha, or awakening, or the true functioning of the universe, has no outer boundary. There is nothing outside of that, right? And this image is pointing us there. It's endlessly big. We can't measure it, right? So we have an innumerable amount of eons and everything they contain within the single pore or the single hair follicle of the Buddha. So all dharmas reflected by all dharmas. We can think of this as a special high-end power that only Buddhas have, but actually, of course, this is happening all the time. Because of interdependence and because of interconnectedness, everything is always present in everything else. We can't really separate. So we're already reflecting from our 84,000, supposedly 84,000 pores and hair follicles. 84,000 just means all the things there are, all the numbers there are. So when we sit zazen and we deeply realize this non-separation, we can see that as bodhisattvas, this is not some mysterious power we need to acquire. This is something which is already here, and we simply need to recognize and understand it. So in zazen, all the parts of our body and mind come together in this one activity of sitting and non-thinking, right? So here's awakening and non-separation completely here in zazen. So the 9th power, making people turn toward the Buddha's teachings and leading them to perfection, bodhidiki. So this is the power of enlightenment that enables sentient beings to aspire for awakening, attain Buddhahood, right? Bodhicitta. So aspiration for awakening, and as we know, we can't just give that to somebody, even as bodhisattvas. We can't go out and sort of hand people bodhicitta. We can't arouse it for them. But we can help to create some conditions, I think, to make it possible for others to recognize the aspiration when it arises and maybe act on that. Maybe we can remove some hindrances for people to work with their bodhicitta. So we can inspire others by the way we carry ourselves, by the way we practice in the world, by the way we encounter the things we encounter, and interact with other beings. Hopefully. Not by forceful evangelizing. This is not what this is telling us to do. We know that doesn't work anyway, right? You can't force this on somebody. So this is not a case of getting up on the soapbox in the street corner and saying the Buddha way is the only way, right? If somebody wants information about what we're doing, it's fine to have that conversation. Your friends, your family ask you, you go to this crazy place and you sit looking at a wall and, what are you doing? It's fine to have a conversation about that. Maybe it's good to have the elevator speech, describe what you're doing in 2 or 3 sentences. If they want more, you can give them more. But the best thing we can do is be our lives and carry our practice in an authentic way, right? Live our lives as best we can, the way Buddha lives and the way bodhisattvas live. That in itself is a means of turning the Dharma. Oh, there's something like that for you. I don't know what that is, but I like what's there, so tell me about it. Maybe it's simply we watch. And as we somebody in a temple, that can be a teacher, a neighbor, a grandma, who might not identify as a bodhisattva, but as a great bodhisattva in the world. 10th power, satisfy all kinds of people with even a single phrase. Tenborin Riki. So Tenborin is turning the wheel of the Dharma, or teaching the Dharma. So this is the power of turning the Dharma wheel by expounding a single phrase in accordance with the different capacities and natures and desires and needs and situations of human beings. So turning the wheel of the Dharma is a very old metaphor. So a moment ago we were talking about vehicles, right? We said anything that moves somebody, so in this case over the shore. So we're not putting wheels on the water, but somebody, something that moves somebody across to the other shore is a vehicle. Turning the wheels of a vehicle moves it forward. So if you're a wheel-turning king in India, you have a mighty chariot that conquers a lot of territory. Turning those wheels moves that chariot forward. If you're the Buddha, you turn the wheel of the Dharma vehicle, and you're covering your ground that way. So you're moving the Dharma forward, you're moving the teachings forward, right? You're carrying them forward by turning the wheel of the Dharma. Now, I always wondered about that metaphor, so I think that's really kind of interesting, how that's related. As bodhisattvas, we turn the Dharma wheel, or we share the Dharma by communicating the right thing at the right time to whoever is in front of us in some way, again, that person can take in, that person can use, that person can relate to. So that's a general look at those 10 bodhisattva powers. That's the Reader's Digest version. Of course, you can dig into any one of those in much greater depth. So again, the practice of the balanced state of dhyana, or the practice of zazen, is a gate of Dharma-Illumination, for it fulfills the 10 powers. So like so much of this tradition, of course, this list of 10 things is actually 10 ways to look at reality. So provisionally, we can make it a list, and we can check things off, and we can describe individual elements, but we know we really actually can't pull these things apart. It's 10 windows into the same thing. So it's useful to consider them individually, but ultimately they're all connected. So when I'm talking about these 10 powers, you may have noticed some themes. Some of these things were overlapping. Some of these things kind of pointed to the same area. So one theme, I think, we can't do any of this bodhisattva work without completely cultivating prajna, or wisdom, right? We need to see what Buddha's really teaching. We need to see what the Dharma is really about. We need to see who we're really working with. Who are we actually talking to? If this was a college class, I would be speaking differently. If you were kindergartners, I would be speaking differently. If you had no exposure to the Dharma, I would be speaking differently. If we were in France, I don't speak French, but I'd be speaking French, right? We have to do what we need to do for the people who are in front of us at this moment. We have to be able to apply one to the other, right? We have to be able to say, I understand the Dharma, and I understand who's in front of me, and I have to see how those things fit. And it's not enough to say, well, I've got it now, so it's time to teach it to others. I'm done practicing now. I've got it. I understand it. I memorized the book. Now it's time to turn around and teach that to others. We all know it doesn't work that way. We have to continuously cultivate, deepen our own practice. If we were teaching in a system, well, we'd be looking for CPUs. Continuing education of some kind, right? So we have to continue our own practice, even as we're turning that around and sharing it with beings and teaching it to beings and working with other beings. We can't just decide to go out and save the world because we won't have the tools to do that. So it's a wonderful thing to go out and decide to save the world. That's a bodhisattva vow. But what tools are we using to do that? If we're relying on our own ego, our own ideas, our own narrow view, we're not going to be so successful at that. second theme that I think emerges from these 10, we need the biggest possible box of tools at our disposal, so we can use the right one in whatever situation we're coming across. So sometimes we lean on wisdom, sometimes we lean on compassion. Those things are not separate, but still. Sometimes we're working in the world of emptiness. Sometimes we're working in the world of form, right? Sometimes we need to bring people back down to earth and say there's a very concrete result of your activity. And sometimes we can say, you know, there's something else happening. There's something larger. There's a larger view. It would be helpful to consider. Sometimes it's important to function within our particular family style, our particular denominational style. Sometimes we need to put that aside. So sometimes it's very important to do the very traditional Soto Zen thing. If I'm a Zen Shuji in Los Angeles, I better be doing the traditional thing. And then sometimes we put that aside and say there's a larger thing happening in this Buddhist tradition. There are other things we could consider, right? There are other parts of this teaching that we could bring in. So we can't fall into when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? If you've only got one tool, if I've only got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if we do, we get stuck, right? We can't adequately help beings. We can't see clearly, we can't help people. Third theme, I think, comes out of these 10. This practice takes commitment and energy and activity. So vow is important. We can ride that wave a little bit, I think, as bodhisattvas, and then we have to actually sit down and do zazen work and study. We have to actually engage in the practice in order to save beings. We can't just take that home, close ourselves up, kind of use it for our own benefit, study what we think is interesting, sit when we feel like it in order to, lower our stress level. We've got to do the zazen work and study. We have to continually cultivate understanding, wisdom, compassion, and go out into the world, right, and engage with that. As much as we're committed to doing our part, sort of meeting the Dharma halfway, if you will, we also know that Buddha nature and awakening are already here. So we're already completely manifesting Buddha nature without a gap, and yet we still have to practice, right? This is Dogen's most basic question. If Buddha nature is already here, awakening is already here, why do we have to practice? So we still have to do these two things. So this still takes energy, commitment, determination, activity. So the basis for all of this is zazen. Of course, this is the intersection of this gate, where we open the hand of thought, we drop off body and mind. This is where we let go of the hindrances that are narrowing our view, blocking our ability to function freely within this one unified reality. So even if it's only for a little while, even if it's for one period of zazen, even if it's 10 minutes of zazen, we get to sit down, drop all that stuff, see clearly, cultivate wisdom and compassion. So this is how we learn to see the way the Buddha sees. This is what makes us powerful bodhisattvas. This is the basis of these 10 powers. They're not magical. They're here every day. We've already got them. We don't need to acquire them. But it's useful to consider them and then how we use those to go into the world and to help beings. So we have a little extra time. How about that? What would you all like to say about any of those 10 powers, about their relation to zazen, about what it means to be a bodhisattva, or whatever is bubbling for you, starting with people in the room? Comments, questions, reflections, things to bring up.
I'll say something then.
Please.
So we normally associate so I'm going to comment about the turning of the Dharma wheel. So we normally think of the first sermon that Buddha gave as the Deer Park sermon, Four Noble Truths. But there is an alternative narrative that when Buddha was enlightened beneath the tree and was still sitting there, there were some merchants that went nearby. You know this story?
Merchants that went nearby.
There were some merchants that went nearby where the Bodhi tree was. And they had a cart. And it got stuck in the mud. You don't know this story?
I don't think so.
Okay, well this is
so even if I do though, tell us the story so we know.
So they get stuck in the mud. And common to the genre of Indian thinking, if you have a problem and you feed a holy man, you get a blessing, you get some merit, and they figure, well, maybe that will get us unstuck. So they went to the Buddha and they fed him, and this is his first meal after his enlightenment. And fed him and said, hey, we got a problem here. We got this cart over here that's stuck. Can you unstuck it? Can you unstick it for us? And I don't know what the mantra was, but he said, okay, just use this mantra. and this mantra will help you get unstuck. Well, I don't believe any of that's literal, because the word samsara means to be stuck. The wheel is stuck. So the turning of the Dharma wheel is to unstick the stuckness of the wheel, right?
Interesting.
So it's right there at the beginning, you know, how to get unstuck.
Yeah, I love that. That's really helpful. Yeah, because you know we think, well, when we hear things like turning the Dharma, we think of Tibetan prayer wheels, right, where you turn those wheels in order to sort of release those teachings into the air, right? But it was interesting to me that that metaphor goes back further than that, and that's interesting because that's a piece I hadn't heard, right? So what a helpful thing just to think about. If we're turning the Dharma wheel, there can't be hindrance. There can't be stuckness. Things have to be flowing freely, things have to be moving freely, or that wheel wouldn't turn. So we have, you know, turning the wheel as an active, sort of intentional, I am teaching the Dharma, but just we know the wheel is turning anyway because the wheel is turning anyway, right? Because the universe is functioning. And that is Dharma that's functioning. So that's an interesting picture. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Others? Is that a hand up or just a scratch? Other things people would like to say here? Sir, have we got anybody at home that wants to make a comment?
Yeah, Neil, go ahead.
All right, Neil.
Hello, thank you, Hoko. I was curious, just maybe if you could talk more about why these are framed, these 10 attributes are framed as powers. I think that, like, that, you know, in English, that suggests, I don't know, something you reach for, or there are connotations there that seem like things that one could easily get stuck on.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the word actually is power, and in some cases, as we've seen, it's a supernatural, you know, traditionally it's a supernatural power. But I think of this as sort of the engine that drives bodhisattva activity. So we need some kind of power in order to drive the engine. So I wanted to particularly take the bodhisattva, the list of bodhisattva, quote unquote, powers, as opposed to the powers of Buddha, because I wanted to make it very much about our everyday practice. And not about this is a great mythology of magical people flying through the air and manifesting and doing all of these things, because what I wanted to get down to is what is it that's driving our bodhisattva activity? So I think of that power as what allows us to do the work, to do the activity, right, of being a bodhisattva, because we know it's not about, as I say, going in the room and closing the door. It's about how do we take that practice off the cushion into the world, actively carrying out, you know, functioning. So we can get stuck on a word like power, because power, we can contrast it, well, somebody's powerful or somebody's powerless. We can think of it as something magical that we acquire. I'm thinking of it as the energy that allows us to do the bodhisattva activity that we vowed to do. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you for mentioning that, because a word like power has baggage. And I'm trying to use it differently. Say it, please.
I'm thinking maybe other alternatives would be something like ability or capacity.
Yeah, I like capacity. Yeah. So I don't want to phrase this as something we go out and acquire, and if we're high-end people, we somehow have some special aura, right? So capacity is good. Like, again, what allows us to do the bodhisattva work. So in a way, these things are, what do I want to say? We have them already, and yet we cultivate them, you know? It's like, as bodhisattvas, some of these things already are happening, and yet, once we pay attention to them, perhaps we fine-tune them, or we know how to use them in the most skillful way. So it's helpful to look at these things kind of discreetly. Please.
I just want to mention that, and I think I brought this up maybe once in a Wednesday night discussion around the time I had come across it, was this word capacitation, particularly I learned in the context of reproductive biology, but that was a great word, and the way you were just...
So you want to, not everybody was there, you want to explain
so
what you...
It was really describing what you just described, the word does, which is to endow capacity into a process of...
Right. And this is not unrelated to the conversation we had last time about merit, right? We're not gathering up these powers for our own sort of aggrandizement or becoming skillful and able and have the capacity to, right, save beings.
What's the
So-
word in the original language?
Pardon me?
What's the word in the original language?
I don't know. Well, Riki, is the Japanese, but it's older than that. I don't know what it is in Sanskrit. If you put it in front of me, I might remember, but I don't know.
I mean, Siddhis is a word that's often used in the Sanskrit for powers. It's not that.
I don't know, because there's more than one word, and I don't know. But there's a homework assignment for somebody. Go look that up and report back. Please.
Yeah, I think it's sort of related to that, like the old Indian concept of a power. Like I remember vaguely, like, and I might be conflating multiple things here, not remembering them quite right, but I think there was a story at some point that someone was like using spiritual powers to try to convert people to Buddhism. And I think the belief at the time was that, like, yes, Buddhist practice can give you these kind of magical abilities, which included things like having your arm reach infinitely long into other spaces, or swimming through the land, or walking through walls, and these sorts of things.
Yep.
But that's actually not exclusive to Buddhism. Other ways can also get you these powers, so therefore you shouldn't use them as a way to, like, bring people into the Buddhist fold. And I sort of wonder, and I'm not sure if this is the case, if maybe these 10 are sort of like an alternative, like these actually are Buddhist powers that
That's
are
interesting.
kind of exclusive to the tradition, but I'm not sure if that's the case.
Well, that could be, because I think there's so much potential context for this. That's why I say there's a million different lists and different versions. So that's really interesting. And it also makes me think that misuse of these powers would be an important element of consideration in the practice. Like, even if you develop these powers, what are you using them for? Are you using them as a bodhisattva to save beings, or are you using them to get money from people? Because sometimes we hear these things, like where precepts came from, don't tell a lie in order to, get support for yourself if you're not actually enlightened, but we're saying you're enlightened, right? So I think it would be possible to really develop these things and then misuse them in some way. So I think that whole piece of context is really important. And also that, of course, potentially these go beyond Buddhist tradition, right? This is really old stuff, really old stuff. So partly what I'm doing today is turning this in a particular way that I hope we find useful in the modern West, because we don't have the cultural context. We could just go, this is just completely irrelevant. This gate is completely irrelevant for us. I'm saying, well, maybe there's something useful we can consider there. Thank you for that context, that's helpful. Other things from anybody, here or at home? Jeff's got another one.
Yeah, this is a question, or asking you to comment a little further on expediency. Because I'm sure that it's important to differentiate it from having the ends justify the means.
I think those are not unrelated.
They're related, but it must be.
So when you say that, the first thing I think of is all the conversations we have about precepts, where I say, here's the precept, don't break this precept. And by the way, as a bodhisattva, sometimes you're going to break this precept for the greater good. And then you're going to take the responsibility for that, and that's why we have vow and repentance, right? So in a way, this is not unrelated. So I'm telling you part of the story because that's what you can take in today, and I recognize that I'm kind of in some way doing you a disservice by not telling you the whole story, but I'm going to take responsibility for that, right? So it's like, we know in this limited human form we can only teach so much, and in this limited human form we can only take in so much, and we're going to go, yep, we recognize limitation. I think this is all about recognizing limitation and saying, I'm going to do everything I can do, and then I'm going to know this bodhisattva vow, I'll never get to the end. Turning the Dharma wheel, I'll never get to the end. Describing something in language, I will never fully be able to do that. So in that way, it's not exactly complete. So in the same way that when we do repentance, when we think about repentance within this tradition, it's not about beating myself up and saying I did something bad. It's about saying my practice is not complete. And I think of expedient in the same way, right? There are times where things are not complete. We recognize that, but for the good of beings, we're going to go down that path, right? So I think it's about, I think it's not about evil intent. I think it's about incompleteness, sometimes for really good reasons,
I'm thinking of the story in the Lotus Sutra, the burning house and the children.
Absolutely.
That sounds pretty expedient.
Yeah, that is the classic example of expedient means. Is he telling a lie? Yes. Is he doing it for a greater good? Probably. So we could say that's expedient means because it's not complete, but it wasn't a quote unquote lie based on I want to get something out of that for my five skandhas. That was about I'm telling part of the truth because there's something else happening here, right? So that's a slippery slope, isn't it? We can convince ourselves we're doing something for the greater good, which is actually all about this one, or maybe partly about this one. And again, that doesn't mean we don't take a good action. We can't be paralyzed by that. We do have to recognize there's some self-clinging in there. I need to recognize that. I need to deal with that. But it might be that still I need to take this action to liberate being. So it's tricky, right? This is why skillful means, expedient means, beneficial action are not, there's no manual. There's no manual. It's all about wisdom and compassion, right? It's all about prajna. It's all about, we have to know what people think, and we have to know what they really need, aside from what we think they need, or what we want them to need, or what we want to offer them, right? So yeah, not easy. It would be nice if there was a manual. I like a manual. Buddha didn't give us a manual. He said, look carefully, people, and then do the right thing. What would others like to say? Here or at home? I see maybe a hand up, or maybe that's me moving. It's me moving, okay. Good. Anything else from anybody? Reflections, please. While he's looking, let's hear from Doju.
Sure, just to sort of share further about expedient means. I remember in grad school when we were kind of learning about that concept, we read this, it's supposed to be an authentic Mahayana sutra, and maybe some of you have heard of it, but I think it's called the Expedient Means Sutra. And it's basically about a guy who commits murder as an expedient means. And in the context of the story, it's like this guy gets on a ship, and in a dream, I think it's like Manjushri or something comes to him and says, one of the merchants on the ship is gonna kill everyone and take everything. And so this bodhisattva decides that his only course of action is to murder this person for the sake of everyone else on board, because it came to him in a dream. And yeah, it seems kind of, the point being, I think that obviously not necessarily the point that the sutra intended to make, but I think for us is that, it's an inherently kind of dangerous concept, I think. And one that we have to be really careful with.
Yeah, we do. Because on the one hand, that's we could say that's a pretty arrogant thing to do, right? You believe your dream and you go out and take somebody's life. And on the other hand, it's also really scary. What if that's really what needs to happen?
Well, that's supposed to be one of the past lives of the Buddha.
Well, maybe that's where the story comes from. But, then we also think about the courage it takes to be a bodhisattva, because who wants to stand up on the ship and, creep up at this guy and kill him? Nobody wants to do that. And yet, what if that really is the bodhisattva activity of the moment? Who wants to take that on? This is not an easy practice. It's not an easy life, right? But I think those stories point us back to that. It's not easy, and we have to pay attention, and we have to be careful, right? So that's, I would say, the ultimate in expedient means, like immoral, not proper, breaking a precept, and yet, right? Maybe that's what really needed to happen in that moment. Not easy stuff. Not easy stuff. I think that's why we keep coming, in this song, we keep having conversations about skillful means, and I think it's because we're wrestling with stuff, right? Anybody else while you're at home that wanted to speak up today? No. Okay, we've exhausted our powers for today. All right. Okay, hearing none, let's go ahead and do our closing chant, and we will move on to tea time, I think. Okay, thank you very much.